Hello and good afternoon. Welcome to everybody to the panel on sustainability that is being organized at the Committee on International Commercial Law of the International Law Association, the American branch. It is my very honor to be here with you today and to moderate this esteemed panel that is presenting to you some very experienced speakers. And without further ado, let me share my screen so I can properly introduce our speakers. So this panel, as you know, will focus on sustainability and ethical trade in still time of uncertainty. But again, we have with us some of the best in the industry and in the legal industry to share with us their experience. What we're going to focus is the role of corporate social responsibility between the self-regulation and the legal obligation, and see what are the issues in respect to these two possible spectrum of the debate. As mentioned, we have with us today Mrs. Diana Verde Nieto. She's the co-founder and CEO of Positive Luxury. She is probably one of the very first and pioneer of sustainability and sustainability-related initiative. Now we can say that finally sustainability is becoming front and center of a lot of our debates. But Diana has been working on this issue for over maybe 3 decades or more, and she founded consultancy in this space already over 20 years ago. In particular, Diana is the co-founder of Positive Luxury, of which she's today the CEO. She will tell more about it. She has a degree from the Kennedy School at Harvard University, and she has been honored also, and of course, and we are absolutely honored to have you with us by the World Economic Forum as a young global leader, almost over a decade ago, already in 2011. She has been working very closely with Vice President Al Gore on issues related to climate change, sustainability, and a lot of the real problem that we are facing today as a planet and as individuals and as corporations. Our second speaker, in fact, in the order you will see, is our first speaker, is Mrs. Gail Leone. Gail Leone is today senior counsel at Dentons. She's also an adjunct professor at Georgetown Law Center, where she teaches intellectual property management. I have the honor to have known Gail for over 20 years at this point. When we met, she was in Milwaukee as the general counsel of Harley Davidson. Before she was the general counsel of US News, she had very important roles as a lawyer managing a variety of teams in real estate, but she has really conducted a lot of work in the space of sustainability, supply chain, global supply chain, and I would say nobody is more experienced than she is in a variety of these issues. And then we are very, very honored to have Brad Brooks Rubin with us today. Brad has just recently taken this new position as strategic advisor responsible for the responsible jury council. But if you look at Brad's CV, also Brad has been very active in the sustainability, corporate social responsibility space, also from a government standpoint. He has extensive experience working as an attorney advisor in the Treasury Department, in the Office of the Chief of Counsel, looking at the foreign asset control. He has been involved in initiatives that relate to money laundering in the global South, particularly in Africa. and has been involved as special advisor for the conflict diamonds at the United States Department of State. And so we have an impressive amount of talent in the room today, and I am first and foremost very honored to be chairing this panel, and I want to thank the ABILA for hosting this panel, and to all the speakers for being here with us today and sharing their precious and very valuable time with our panelists. Just very quickly, housekeeping matters. We will do two rounds of presentation, and we will accept some question in the middle if the public so want, but otherwise we will also take Q&A at the end. Something else I want to remind everybody is the code for the CLE. I will show that again at the end before the Q&A. Please take it down, because without the code, you can't add CLE points for the session. Some material were collected and distributed by our administration of ABILA. Thank you again. And so without further ado, we will have our speaker, Diana Verdenieto, giving a small introduction before passing the microphone and the Zoom window to Gail. Please, Diana, I'm going to start the slides and you can just say next slide.
Thank you very much, Irene, and thank you very much, everybody, for giving me the opportunity to be here with you tonight. Of course, we're going to talk about kind of hard-hitting issues, and we're going to deep dive into, corporate social responsibility and sustainability. But I'd like to start giving you a global context of why we are doing this. This unbelievably beautiful picture of the Earth was actually shot by Apollo 8 on the 24th of December, 1968. Is beautiful, isn't she? I mean, blue, clear, and incredibly inspiring. Every time I look at this picture called Earth Rising, it gives me hope and pride to our beautiful world. If we go to the next slide, this is what the Earth looks today. So from the outside, our Earth is covered of space waste. This is between satellites and different particles and scrap metal all around our planet. And we are responsible of turning that beautiful, clear picture of our planet to this. But also, we have not done this just in the exterior of our planet. If we go to the next slide, this is what we're doing in the inside of our planet, which is about CO2 emissions. So I have been working in the climate crisis for about 23 years, and some of my peers and mentors has been working in this field for almost 50 years. So we know this is coming for a very long time, but we only have 8 years really to start making proper real impact to midpoint before we actually set to 2050 net zero targets. So if we knew this, why we have not acted before? Well, because we're humans, we never do. So I don't want to bore you with the science, but cutting a very long story short, we finally accepted that climate change could be perhaps due to our emissions and our impact of our planet. And how it works is basically we have industry from all ilks, like agriculture, steel, oil and gas, fashion, in which pumps huge amount of GHG, so greenhouse gases. Those greenhouse gases go up into the atmosphere, and because the atmosphere is kind of accumulative, the CO2 emissions bump one into each other. Since the Industrial Revolution, this is what we have been doing, asphyxiating our planet by these emissions. The Earth heat up this kind of atmosphere, and then it goes back to us by obviously melting our glaciers, and therefore our sea levels are rising, and with that come complex issues like ocean acidification, etc. If we go to the next slide, Please, thank you. So there is two villains in this movie. One is called CO2. This is probably the most long-lasting villain. Why? Because when we take CO2 up in the atmosphere, it stays there for 100 years or more sometimes. So this is from all industry, electricity, industry, transportation, residential, and all other combustion areas that is not fossil fuel related. But then the second villain, which is not as famous as CO2, is called methane. Can we go back to the next? Can we go to the next slide? Thank you. Methane is much deadlier than CO2, but what is great about methane, or not great, is the fact that actually only take 10 years to actually move away from the atmosphere. So this is where we can actually make really, really quick wins to get to net zero. And this time from energy sources, waste management, and agriculture sources. So can we go to the next slide? So I believe deeply, like Alice in Wonderland, if we actually think about 10 impossible things before breakfast, that we can actually together by joint effort and joint action can actually revert this. And how can we do this? Well, first and foremost, electrifying transportation, and this comes from developing and developing world, decarbonizing the grid, fixing the food systems, protect, restore, and rewild nature, clean up energy like mining, fossil fuel, agriculture, etc. Remove carbon from the atmosphere. This is by looking at the soil and the oceans. They actually absorb a lot of our carbon emissions. Win politics and policy. This I don't have so much hope. Innovate, and this is the young entrepreneurs and sometimes not so young that are dreaming a future which is sustainable. Invest into the developing world to develop sustainably. So instead of paying suppliers 180 days in arrears, pay them in advance with clauses and penalties toward investment into climate solutions. And 10, a movement into tangible, measurable, and accountable action. And this is how together, actually, I really believe this, that together we can actually get to net zero by 2050. And if we can get to the next slide. And one more. So right now we are in this inflection point, which is probably the most exciting moment in, I think, the history of the world, which is we have two ways. We can actually work together to get to net zero, or choose not to, and get our climate hotter and our planet even more on fire than it is. And I take this from former Vice President Al Gore, who said that the sustainability revolution is going to be as fast as the digital revolution and as revolutionary or transformational as the industrial revolution. And only by doing it together is we can actually get to where the real impact is. So thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to give you some context of why we are talking about this. And please let me hand it back to Irene. Thank you.
Thank you, Diana, very much. And now, without further ado, Gail, please.
Thank you. Despite Irene's kind words in the introduction, as you can see from listening to Diana, and you will hear listening to Brad, my job is to be here between two experts in this space and to give you a framework and tell you a little bit about how we got here in a little bit broader context than what Diana just laid out, and the add-ons that we now see. Let's go to the first slide. ESG has really evolved, and so sustainability is clearly part of this. But what's very exciting and what gives me hope, Diana, is the fact that I think it has a much broader lens today. And I think that gets to the sustainability and ethical trade part of this. In the mid 2000s when I was at Harley Davidson in response to a shareholder inquiry, which was sort of early on at that time. I pulled together a group of director level people. There were about 10, and it was sort of a worldwide group. And we had a head start because for a US global company, we actually talked about not just shareholders, but we talked about stakeholders, which was pretty novel at that time. And what we did was to address what corporate sustainability meant to us in a very authentic way, looking at our products, our distribution, our consumers. And we did that. It became one of the 4 pillars of the corporate strategy of the company. But in retrospect, as groundbreaking as that was, it didn't take as holistic an approach to the E and the S and the G that we see today. We didn't integrate our social impact position into it, which was significant at the time, but it was sort of managed to the side. And so 15 years since that time, what I see now in working with my clients at Denton's is a much more holistic approach as to how they evaluate the material, environmental, and social impacts of their businesses, and then build that into their governing corporate strategy. So let's just go to the next slide. So what is actually ESG? So we talked about corporate sustainability, and what Diana was talking about is really the urgency regarding environmental. And that still is a primary driver in the conversations that we're having today. Although the interesting thing about the conversations we're having today is there's a lot more focus on biodiversity and product innovation. When companies are measured for ESG impact, innovation really gets the highest scores, which was number 8, I think, on Alice's list. But it might be one of the most efficient ways to solve some of our environmental issues. From a social perspective, this is where you're going to see a real focus on trade. Today, we're talking about it, including modern slavery, human rights, labor standards. This is really an important aspect because while we've maybe been focused internally with our own workforce, the fact that we're now talking about supply chain with these same issues, I think is really significant. And then from a governance perspective, what we're talking about today is more than just ethics codes and employee and supplier codes and Foreign Corrupt Practices Act and other anti-bribery statutes. What you're really focused on is transparency, disclosure about practices, violations, audits, political contributions, board diversity, executive diversity, pay equity, and most importantly, accountability or oversight. And I'll talk about that a little later. What I do know is that one size does not fit all, that each ESG story is different for each company, and it requires taking a look at your industry, your location, culture, products, services, whether you're a public or private company, your stakeholders, most importantly, defining and looking at who your stakeholders really are. Let's go to the next slide. What Diana was talking about, though, there is an urgency now, and I think that's critical. It's an urgency not just looking at or driven by looking at the difference in the planet, pictures that she showed, but there's an urgency coming from lots of different places, from your employees who are making decisions about where to go to work, from regulators who are moving really from principle-based to prescriptive metrics. I mean, just yesterday, the UK announced a new corporate climate disclosure rule. In the US, obviously we're looking at infrastructure bill. Biden's going to be attending COP26. Banks are looking at how companies will meet their KPIs and requirements in loan agreements. Insurance companies are really clearly focused on ESG issues. So boards of directors are focused on it as a result, and CEOs need to be delivering on it. And that's why finally these conversations are really in the boardroom. And for the last 18 months, we've realized, significant climate change issues clearly, But we've also had global race and racial disparity issues that have come to the forefront. And on top of that, we've had a pandemic, which really drilled down on health and safety for our employees. And if those three pressures are not enough, you really are seeing pressures from investors. I mean, BlackRock CEO Larry Fink has had an annual letter to CEOs, and he really sort of doubled down on it this year. One interesting note in his letter was that everyone thought that the focus on climate change would slow during the pandemic. And Fink noted in his letter that from January through November 2020, investors in mutual funds and ETFs invested $288 billion globally in sustainable assets. It was a 96% increase over the whole of 2019. So climate risk is investment risk, but he believes really that the climate transition presents a historic investment opportunity. Along with the pressure from investors, you also see the proxy advisory firms taking significant positions on board diversity, including NASDAQ requiring board diversity, which was a bold position, which was approved by the SEC just last month. So let's go to the next slide. So when all of those folks are focused on ESG, you do know that boards will be paying attention to that, and they'll be paying attention to what their peer groups say as well. And one of the most interesting things, and it's really spawned a whole discussion in the US in particular about the purpose of a corporation. And about almost 200 CEOs signed a Business Roundtable statement on the purpose of a corporation. This was a new statement, a revised of their old, supporting a much broader view of corporate responsibility, not just for shareholders, but also for a broader group of stakeholders. And I think this is significant because it goes right to the heart of governance. And it came at the same time we saw the convergence of all the other pressures I just reviewed from consumers, employees, investors, proxy advisory firms, and the exchanges. And even some of the states in the US, like California, have moved to regulate. So it is actually a perfect storm, which does create a perfect opportunity. And I think we are, as Diana said, at a real inflection point on this. So I will turn it back to Diana, who I think is going to help us navigate this storm.
I should know how to do this by now. Thank you so much, Gail, for such a fantastic speech just now, and just to give us a little bit more of the context. So, I mean, like you just said, in this inflection point, we really need to reimagining businesses, how the world will look like, and the legal framework is imperative. Because without that, without pushing that legal framework, there is a lot of things that, keep being voluntary and therefore are not enforceable. If we can go to the next slide. Thank you. So this is what we do at Positive Luxury. We are a sustainability accelerator, and we help luxury lifestyle brands to really accelerate their trajectory towards environmental, social governance, and innovation, compliance, and beyond. So what we do is we first and foremost assess them according to this framework, which is environmental, social governance, and innovation. Then we analyze the gaps and the risk from two areas, materiality and dynamic materiality. And then after understanding what are the risks, we give them the opportunity to resolve these issues that they have, not just within their supply chain, within their four walls, but also scope 3, which is within their suppliers. So we not only assess them, but also we give them the opportunity to actually assess their suppliers in two ways. One is by capturing data across their supply chain to actually have this fidelity of information that we don't have today. And secondly, but also understand what are the risks lies within the supply chain. If we go to the next slide, thank you. And we don't do this alone. It's absolutely no way that any certification can do this alone. So This is the framework that I was telling you about. And in the environmental side, we don't leave any stones unturned. We look at climate, energy, water, waste, circularity, logistics, supply chains. On the social side, we look at diversity and inclusion, health and safety, ethics and operations, human rights, obviously, community investment. On the governance side, operations, reporting, SDGs, and the innovation, which for me is my favorite part, is we challenge businesses to imagining a future which have no fossil fuel dependencies. So what would it take to actually have a future that is net zero? What kind of innovations can capture carbon from the atmosphere? What machinery you might have to do? What kind of monitoring you have to have in place? And we have been incredibly lucky to work with fantastic innovative brands. So for example, when you think about diamonds, you have 3 types of diamonds. Natural diamonds that come from the earth, lab-grown diamonds, which obviously are lab-grown, meaning that are biomimic. They're still a diamond, but actually are biomimic in exactly the same qualities. And now we have sky diamonds. What are sky diamonds? They capture the CO2 from the atmosphere, they compress that into heat. And that is what, instead of having the perfect storm, instead of having within the kimberlite, it happens in a lab. And actually you can create a diamond with the exact same qualities than a natural diamond by capturing carbon from the atmosphere. So, the innovation really exists, and we have actually most of the tools. And if we go to the next slide, I was saying that we cannot do this alone. So we go to a lot of the certification and accreditations that are throughout the supply chain and have very robust chain of custody like the RJC. And we take in account their frameworks to ensure that we have complete integrity across the ESG plus frameworks throughout the supply chain, throughout scope 1, 2, and 3 on the suppliers. We take in account about 180 certifications across 7 industries. And if you go to the next slide. Our process is unbelievably stringent. This is not the best form of PR for positive luxury, but it's really hard to go through, because you actually have to think about business transformation, really how to embed the principles of sustainability within your business strategy, moving from having a sustainability strategy to making sustainability your strategy to actually have a resilient business going forward. And without further ado, I'd like to pass this to Irene and then to Brad, because obviously we can't do this alone. And the Responsible Jewelry Council team have done a fantastic job in strengthening and to make our jobs really easy, because we as a brand, are you Responsible Jewelry Council? Yes, well, we know that the brand is good. So over to you, Irene. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Diana. And now, Brad, please, the podium is yours.
Thank you. And thank you for that great introduction to the RJC. I'll take all the credit for that, even though I just joined RJC, in the last month. I think what I want to do with my few minutes to start is to try to talk about maybe some more, maybe drill down into some practical questions that I think companies and lawyers face when dealing with these questions of, should we support regulation or do we stay in the world of voluntary disclosure? And in addition to the work I'm doing now at the RJC, and in the past, I also worked in the gem and jewelry sector at an organization called the Gemological Institute of America, which is a lab and school company. And as Irene mentioned, working on sanctions and also conflict diamonds for the US government. I've also, for the last 6 years, and continue to have a part-time role within a civil society organization called The Century. The Century grew out of a human rights organization, the Enough Project. And the Enough Project was one of the real leaders in advocating for the adoption of Dodd-Frank 1502 for conflict minerals. And when I was at the State Department, I was in the Economic Bureau, and I was dealing with the conflict minerals legislation when it was first a bill and then when it was adopted. And since then, over the last 10 years, have really worked a lot on that world and seen the evolution in how civil society and how governments and how industries deal with that issue. And it's really left me, in some ways, I'm going to speak very much for myself rather than officially for the RJC, I think. And it's left me wondering on a number of issues, and maybe in the second round, we can get into some of these topics a bit more in a conversation. So the first thing I want to say in terms of the question of the panel of the tension between legal obligation and reporting is that many of the risks that fall within the ESG category, particularly human rights, but I think even climate risk, as Diana was laying out, already fit within what companies are doing in terms of existing legal obligations. That may be with respect to sanctions, that may be with respect to how they deal with chemicals and their facilities. A wide array of legal obligations that companies already have and already adapt to, but that haven't, in many cases, in my experience, really been integrated in a company so that as the company is pursuing its sanctions risk, for example, or its operational risk in one place, thinking about how that ties together with climate risk. And as we see the climate emergency, and Diana laid it out so well, I think we've all seen it more and more where climate risk is hitting other legal obligations and other human rights. And so it's not a separate thing that's over here. It is now core to the operation of our business. I think few companies, in my experience, again, have figured out how to integrate legal risk so that the dichotomy between, are we talking about an ESG issue from a self-reporting perspective or from a legal obligation, that dichotomy is increasingly becoming, I think, a false one. And I think there's more that we can all do to really encourage companies to integrate their approach to risk and see all these risks and obligations together. The second is the fact that there is a tension. And I mean, you know, Diana's map of all the issues that they're looking at, there are many situations where those issues can be in tension with one another. And I think that is where the question of, are we pushing towards legal obligations or are we pushing towards reporting, and what should companies be allowed to take voluntary steps or should they be required? I think the thing that we often miss is that there is a political question of what is there one issue that is more important than the other? So for example, right now, there is a real push for the development of batteries for electric cars and electric vehicles and a range of electronics in a way that can produce energy more in a cleaner fashion that can address the climate crisis. So one of the minerals that is essential to that production is cobalt. A significant amount of cobalt is found in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and we are seeing a conflict, both conflict, but also human rights and labor rights issues develop around the way cobalt is being mined. And I think, so we have at that stage, a real question for companies. I think over the long term, and I hope Diana is right, that innovation will eventually take over and all of those goals will come together. But in the short term, there's a real question. If you're a company potentially interested in procuring electric batteries, how do you resolve the tension between, I want that product that can produce energy more cleanly, and I want a product that is in line with my human rights and labor rights requirements and standards? And again, in an innovative world, and in a world like the RJC and others, we hope that those all fit together, but the truth is that they don't often fit together. And as a result, companies are left wondering, what do I do? And that really is the tension between when is reporting, when are voluntary approaches appropriate, and when is legal regulation appropriate. My own view is that legal regulation is appropriate when we've made a decision on how do you resolve those questions? Where does a company go? What do we actually want them to do when faced with that question? When we haven't decided that, and I would argue that in many cases our political leadership hasn't decided that, And similarly, civil society hasn't decided that. We have a lot of, I think, competing interests and competing tensions between civil society organizations and their demands of companies. Companies face reports and engagement from civil society organizations like mine that are worried about corruption and human rights issues. And on the other hand, perhaps one worried more about the climate crisis, and a company may find itself hit on all sides and again, trying to decide what to do. And I think my own perspective on this is that if we look to situations such as conflict minerals reporting, where Congress decided and said, we want all companies reporting on whether or not they're procuring minerals from in a way that is benefiting armed groups in Eastern Congo. Before, I would say that law, although I think it has achieved much, I think that law was adopted in a way before the tensions of what are we going to gain and what are we going to lose by adopting this law that requires companies to do that. So as a result, we've had 10 years of reporting, and we've had a situation where there has been a lot of gain on the ground, a lot of progress in conflict-free mining. On the other hand, many communities haven't seen the benefit of responsible sourcing. And so we've required companies to do their supply chain analysis, to do their assessment, to wrestle with how do they resolve this on their own, but without enough guidance to really get them there. Sorry, I have way too many things to say on this, and I've allowed myself to ramble a little bit. So let me just try to bring it home for a second by saying, I think in many situations, companies are facing a whole array of standards, a whole array of very big topics to try to solve. And I think the more we can, as a community, legal, civil society, government, private sector, figure out how to integrate those questions and integrate those risks, and be able to provide companies with answers. And when we provide them with answers, then require them to provide the level of reporting and transparency that we all need in order to assess, is this company doing a good job or a bad job against our expectations? I think the question that Gail put out about what is the role of a company is a really critical one. And I think there are very differing expectations and ideas about what a company is and what a company should be doing between government, between civil society, and in the private sector itself. And I hope in the next round, A, that I'll be a little bit clearer, but B, that we can sort of wrestle with the questions of where the tension is between all the goals that we have for our planet, all the goals that we have for how companies will exist within those expectations, and then what do we actually require them to do? And is that best achieved by passing a law and requiring them to do X? Or can we rely on companies to know what the expectations are and take on those obligations themselves? So let me stop there and kick it back.
So, thank you, Brad. I wanted to open to the public, to the audience, if you would like to ask. We have a couple of questions maximum to the panelists. Otherwise, before we move to the second round, I can ask a question to the panelists, or the panelists can ask questions to each other. So, is there any question from the audience at this point? And I assume that, Thomas, you can spotlight or make us see, because I don't see the list, I don't see the people, so I'm a bit, this type of panel where you don't see the audience. So if we don't have a question from the audience immediately, one of the quick interjection I would like to make for our panel is the following. I think the overview was very interesting about this tension between issues, priorities. There is so much on the plate that how and what can we address? And then certification does work. When companies are ethical by themselves, they often go above and beyond just the legal standard. The issue is when they're not. And, perhaps now the tide is changing, but we know that even with some of the certification, we had a bit of the so-called greenwashing, trying to diversity facade, human rights masquerading, when at the end of the day, there is far less, there is a lot of opacity, full transparency is something that is very hard to reach. And sometimes may also not be advisable, because some company might actually want to be stricter internally, but don't want their competitor to be able to misuse some of this information. And so, I actually respect some of these concerns about, there is always a bit of gray areas and right and wrongs on all sides. So my question is to the panelists, and perhaps very, very quickly we can go around, is now that we have so many issues so pressing, and there's no magic recipe, if we could focus on one issue based on what you have said, climate, human rights, transparency, certification, versus which one do you think is the one where we can faster get higher return, because we are in a moment where we are in a rush? And so what is, from company standpoint, lawyer standpoint, investors, and again, legal aspect standpoint, something that you think could become and could be a priority in terms of return for the functioning of our business in a way that is more sustainable? Perhaps we could start with Brad, because and then we go back.
Sure. I mean, I think my view on this is, I think there's no answer to that, right? I mean, I think, I'm certainly compelled by Diana's presentation and everything I know about the climate crisis, but all of these, on one hand, all of these issues link together, right? It's in some ways maybe even false to say there's a difference between human rights and development and the climate. They're all linked together. But at the same time, those are very distinct issues in terms of what practically a company can do. My own view on it is twofold. One, either we have to push our political leaders to make those decisions, right? We elect them. And so if we're looking at the idea that there should be legal regulation, then that's because we've decided that there's a right answer. And that's really what our government leaders are for. If we haven't gotten there, and I would say that we're unlikely to get there, so then we're at a situation of whether we're doing something A, because we think it's right, or B, because the public and the market is pushing us to get there as companies. Mm-hmm. And so I think really the answer there is companies have to make those choices for themselves, but then be honest about what they've chosen. And I think that's where reporting and certification often falls short, which is too often, if you read a lot of ESG reporting, most of it, in my view, is not very good, because companies are putting out only the positive side, and they're only putting out a piece of what's happened on every issue. My own view is the best ESG reporting and the best reporting on all of these issues, and really the best way we're going to get further down the line and innovate, is for companies to say, these are the 15 issues that we face in our supply chain. We've chosen as a company to prioritize these two. Here's why, and here's what we're doing about them. Warts and all. Some of it was good, some of it wasn't good. We're learning, we're getting there. And that is basically, if that was happening universally, well, then we as the public and ultimately government leaders would actually know, where are we going? What are we doing? I think without that, in a world where companies are picking and choosing and wanting to do everything because all of these expectations are on top of them, we're not really getting where we need to get to. And so my own view is, let's get to a point where reporting and transparency is not just, here's everything we're doing on everything, but only the positive parts of it, but here's the decisions we made. They're really hard. They may not even be the right ones, but they're the ones we made now. And here's what we're doing about them. And again, warts and all, and let the public go from there. And I think that's how we can sort of try to figure out, is human rights or development more important than the climate? We'll decide on that together, but only with the information. So let me stop there.
Well, and I think what Brad is saying is right. I think that companies, as I said earlier, there's no one size fits all. There's no one story that's going to dominate. That you've got to look at what your priorities are for your business. I think the difference today, and what I try to work with our clients on, is that it's not so much, when they're talking about the S space and philanthropy, it's not so much about giving away money. It's about how you make it in a different way. And that gets to putting an ESG lens on decisions you make. I mean, the point that Brad made, that to me is really the key. It's that to be effective, your strategy, your ESG strategy, your sustainability strategy, how you manage your supply chain has got to be integrated into your overall corporate strategy. Because if you're looking at what companies are doing, they're going to allocate their capital to those issues. And so if you're going to have an effective solution, you need to have a different lens when you're looking at it. So you're going to create a new product. You've got to look at how is that product going to impact the environment? How is that product going to impact our workforce? How is it going to impact the supply chain? And then how are we going to have oversight and measure the effect of this product on, the ES and the S? And so I think it's that lens looking at what you've decided to be the priorities where you can make an impact. And I think that integration is absolutely key. But the other part of it that I think is going to be very interesting is who's going to have oversight of this. And to your point, Brad, about disclosure and how you're going to talk about this publicly, the board's going to have to make tough decisions on that balance ultimately. There are regulations clearly that have been out there. I mean, we've had climate disclosure regulations for the last 10 years at least. There are human capital management disclosure regulations. If you're a company, a publicly traded company in the US, and most of them are global, so they have those now. You've got the regulations are coming fast and furious. Almost daily, there's something. You have the German supply chain disclosure law. You've got Modern Slavery Act out of the UK and out of the state of California. So there are more regulations. Some of them are still principle-based. They're not metrics, to your point, Brad, that they're not specific. So companies still have to decide what they're going to focus on and what they're going to disclose. But I think the pressure that's now on boards to have greater oversight is another sort of a converging factor that's coming. There are going to be requirements for greater duty of care, duty of loyalty to companies. We see that now coming out of the Delaware courts. So for companies in the US, that's a significant issue. But the requirement is that they do more and that they monitor. It's not just okay to have a compliance plan in place, but you've got to monitor the effectiveness of that. And so I think all of those things now are going to force this conversation in boardrooms, which means that the governance piece of it hopefully will drive an acceleration in the E space and environmental as well as in the S, which gets to your supply chain pretty clearly.
I mean, thank you, Gail. I agree with you both. I have a slightly different perspective working with companies, which is not just the big companies, also you have small businesses. So I do agree that is volunteer, and a lot of that you have either legislation or actually what you do, what's right for your business. But I still think that there are 3/4 areas that are non-negotiable today, not for action, not for disclosure, that they have to be there. One is carbon. Is really how do you measure carbon emissions, how do you internalize your supply chain carbon emissions, and how you migrate to decarbonizing your business and reimagine that business model. So I think that's not the non-negotiable, and it will, you have disclosure now as an obligation from, well, after COP finishes. The second part is biodiversity. So this is also non-negotiable. This is the way that we work within the kind of boundaries of our planet, and we choose to rewild or replenish or conserve. It's absolutely not just a business obligation, but a moral obligation. And again, this is no negotiable. And this is science. So you have science-based targets for carbon, and you have science-based targets for nature. And they're over, 170 companies, which is not that many, into science-based targets for nature, and carbon it's moving very, very, very fast. The third part is social. So of course you have Modern Slavery Act, which is only for companies that are over 36 million pounds or dollars turnover, but the rest also have an obligation to look at either living wages or minimum wages within the country of operations. This is absolutely non-negotiable. And the fourth part, which is not yet, the press has caught the eyes, is water. And you have heard this first here. So water is becoming, or will become, probably one of the three material issues to us, because this year, 2021, was the hottest year on record, was the highest year in which CO2 emissions have been to date, right, on record, and actually was the driest year on record yet. So these are non-negotiable for action, and therefore non-negotiable for disclosure. And my last point is about the role of certifications. A lot of businesses are still a bit kind of reluctant to certifications, because traditionally certifications have been siloed. So you have, organic or fair trade, or, fair mind, fair goal, RJC, and so on. But there are more and more certifications like Positive Luxury and the Butterfly Mark, which are completely holistic. We take in account the environment, social, governance, innovation, from a 360 within the business, not just on supply chain. So these, coupled with the obligations of new frameworks of disclosure for bigger companies like GRI and TIFF, I think it is the new one that I can never remember the acronym. This is going to become, transparency is going to become the norm in terms of the expectation. And if you do not have your data publicly available, you will be lagging.
Diana, the only thing I'd say, though, about the size of the company, that the smaller companies are going to feel it in the supply chain themselves. So that if you're an automotive parts supplier, it's General Motors, through their supply chain code of conduct and requirements, are going to require what they need to deliver. If you're selling or you're manufacturing a luxury good, you're selling it through a distribution point, whether it's a Tiffany's or it's Walmart, they're going to require certain certifications or certain compliance with standards, looking at their supply chains. So I think this is, today, given the focus on sustainability and trade, I think that even the smaller companies are going to, even if they don't, meet the threshold for certain legal regulations, I think they're going to have to comply with some of the things that are coming down because they're in the supply chain.
And I think you have seen my next part of the presentation beautifully. I don't know if it's my turn or it's Gail's turn.
But this is coming along very nicely. So there was a question in the chat, but we will address it at the end, to make sure we address all the points. So Gail, I would move back to you for just a few minutes, so we can wrap it up.
And I really sort of covered this already. I think the key is going to be both for legal compliance and voluntary compliance is going to be board oversight. I think those decisions, boards are going to have to sort of focus on what that balance is going to be. Clearly, disclosure transparency is coming out of the G side, what companies disclose. Those conversations, I think, in mindful boardrooms are being held now. But there also are some higher risk areas. We've historically had the anti-bribery as a high risk, anti-human trafficking as a high risk, foreign sanctions. But I think today, more so than I've ever seen, those conversations are focused on the supply chain and trade. And to your point, Brad, I think there is a focus on whether it's cobalt coming out of the Democratic Republic of Congo, or it's cocoa on the Ivory Coast and the Nestle case that went up. I think all of those factors are now front and center, and boards are having conversations about them, in some cases for the first time. But clearly, from an oversight perspective and a standard of oversight that is becoming more stringent, more rigorous, and I think is a wake-up call. And I think it's sort of the convergence of this greater need for oversight, which we've seen coming out of cases in the US since the summer of 2019. Alongside this sort of convergence of pressure that's coming from consumers, from NGOs, from the talent, from your employees, and then sort of increased regulatory. I do a fair amount of work with boards. I sit on 2 corporate boards, and I know that these are conversations that are being had as to how to manage these areas, and then ultimately how to disclose what you're doing about that. To the point that you made earlier, Brad. So I think it's a balance. I think you've got to set what the priorities are, what's material to your own company and your distribution, and to your employees, and the broader concept of stakeholders, and then make those decisions, because you can't do everything in one day. So it's got to be a journey, and that journey, I think, is got to be disclosed, and there needs to be transparency about that journey along the way. So we can go on.
Diana.
Yes, of course. I mean, just basically, I just want to build on what Gail said, which is basically the global source versus the global south. And this is a very clear picture of how our emissions work today and how wealth is represented today. The blue bits, the rich country, the red bit, the poor countries, give and take. This is in a very simplistic way. And today, 82% of all emissions come from the red bits, so from the global south. And more of the supply chains are in the global south, because in global north, what we have done is basically we have outsourced our emissions down under. And I don't mean Australia, I mean just directly to the global south. So what we need to do is, whether governments actually succeed or not into securing the 100 billion that has been promised to the developing world 3 years ago and never has been materialized. Hopefully in this scope, they actually put a real clear roadmap, like NATO, for example, that 2% of all GDP goes into, guns, etc. Unless this clear roadmap comes from government, the responsibility of developing the global south comes from private sector. And business can really be transformative and can really be a force for good. So what I mean by this is, like I said earlier, is how do you work with your suppliers? How do you internalize those supply chains? And how do you work, or how do you invest in those suppliers to develop in a sustainable manner? And that is from an environmental perspective and from a social perspective. And I don't want to be disrespectful of the governance and the reporting, but if the first 2 are really well done, the third comes along anyhow, because they will be super proud to actually have that transparency and have that disclosure. So, I mean, I think the next step, is really how companies can help develop the developing world. And I would like to call out one brand, actually, that it has been a phenomenal case study in terms of how it has tackled this, which is Gucci. Gucci, not that long ago, has asked for a loan, an ESG bound loan, to develop their suppliers with very clear terms and conditions that the money would only be used to develop environmental and social causes. So it's possible. It's here, and it requires innovation. And of course, instead of having the ability for the global south to ask the loans from the banks with absolutely astronomical, interest rates, and sometimes it's impossible for them to secure them, is how can, developed world brands can help to develop the developing world. I don't remember if I have another slide or not.
I don't think so, but let's see. Yes.
So, I mean, this is pretty much what I said. It's like, the role of climate crisis is really to help the other countries to develop, look after biodiversity, retrofit new buildings. This is both sides, developed and developing world. Understand the emissions by location and by volume. Improve the fidelity of the data we've discussed before, and obviously help to decarbonize the economy. So, I mean, I think we have said it all.
I think, there is this one that still needs to be said.
Well, I mean, what I love about this slide is that the climate crisis cannot be like the moon landing. It cannot just belong to governments. It has to be everybody's business, and it has to be transparent. So, this is the key. We need to make this in a different way than the way that we handle like the moon landing.
Thank you. Brad.
Sure, and I know time is short, so I'll try to be reasonably quick, and maybe actually try to, in some ways, also answer one of the questions in the chat. I'll start by quoting I'm a huge music fan, in particular of hip hop and punk rock, and two of my favorite lyrics always kind of come up in this context. So a rapper named Chance the Rapper from Chicago, who's become somewhat famous, but one of his very early tapes, he had a line that said, "Sometimes the truth don't rhyme." And then I'm in DC, and we're famous for many things, but one of them is hardcore punk rock, and one of the more famous bands from here is called Fugazi, and one of their more famous songs, they have a line, "Function is the key." And to me, in this world, I sort of live by both of those lines. So sometimes the truth don't rhyme and function is the key, to me, mean, look, sometimes you have to be honest about things they don't all fit together, right? Like sometimes a rapper can't make all the right words sound exactly right, but they're still the right words for that moment. And function is the key, meaning you just have to figure out what it is you're actually going for, and then really ensure that your approach matches that function. So the question about, I've been advocating for warts and all reporting and transparency. Does that actually help? And I think it's a fair question, because in some cases it doesn't. There's two of the, I'd say, more engaged companies around minerals issues and supply chain issues in general are Apple and Google. And they have been very engaged with my nonprofit and a range of others around minerals issues, and receive good rankings and good reports from a number of NGOs. But 2 years ago, because of their connection to forced labor issues in DRC, were sued by another NGO, partly as a result of some of the reporting that they had done. So I think there are times when it doesn't necessarily, it isn't always going to be to a benefit. It isn't, there are reporters who will get it wrong. There are campaigners who will take a piece of something that they've seen in a report and run with it. We at the RJC are wrestling with this right now. How do we figure out how to be transparent about the audits that have been conducted? And will the public understand the difference between, say, the anti-corruption policy that we have? Maybe the policy could be a little bit better. The language wasn't exactly right. is that the same as the fact that a company was actually corrupt? It falls under the same heading in a report, anti-corruption, but there's a big difference between we need to tweak the language of our report, of our policy, and we actually did something wrong. To me, the real answer in all of this is it's not perfect, but it is about the benefits, to me, still outweigh the costs, especially in the idea that there are NGOs who do rankings. And those rankings these days really do, I think, prioritize and emphasize companies that are open, that are transparent, and that are engaged on hard issues. I would say 30 years ago, if you look at the Kimberley process as a model, the approach was if something bad is happening, we want it out of your supply chain. We don't want any of these things in the supply chain. And I think that is transformed through standards, through certification, and through the approach of due diligence to say, we want it to get better, but we don't want you to leave the global south. We don't want you to leave hard issues. We want you to engage on them and try and be responsible. And here are a lot of standards and a lot of approaches that can help you do that. And we want you to tell us what you're doing. And so it takes some work and it takes some effort, but to the idea that it's a barrier to entry for, especially for smaller companies, I think, many of us in the civil society and in the certification world often do a disservice because so much of this is about how to maximize business, how to maximize profits. As Gail said, it should be what the board is thinking about in terms of how these things integrate. And I think at times we make it sound, frankly, a lot harder than it is, or a lot more onerous than it is. And I think the more companies are willing to engage with civil society, with the media, saying, and government saying, here's what we're doing, and actually having a conversation, the more that the benefits will accrue to those companies who are doing warts and all reporting. And the last thing I'll say is, if you're not doing warts and all reporting, and you're doing the sort of, hey, it's all rainbows and unicorns in our factories and in our supply chain, at some point you're going to have to disclose the warts and all anyway, because somebody's going to get around to saying, we don't really believe that it's rainbows and unicorns. And so you're going to get there one way or the other. And to me, being proactive and engaged with NGOs and making NGOs come back with real answers, which many times I'll admit we don't have. That's really important. And I think that's how we're going to make this progress. I would agree. I'll just say with Diana, we are at a really exciting moment in history, and it really requires everybody to be a part of it, not just everybody pointing fingers at the other one saying, okay, it's time for you to do it. Like, we really do all have to be in this together, and this is how.
Well, and I actually think, Brad, that companies today, I mean, it's expensive to change out your suppliers, that there are a lot of resources that some of the smaller companies can use to help them move in the direction that they need to move in this space. And I think you're right. I think being open to that and making the changes that are necessary and talking about that, I think, is a better place to be. If you're only disclosing, rainbows and unicorns, that actually is going to create more liability for the company than if you sort of tell honestly where you are in that journey.
Yeah, and just wrapping up. First, housekeeping, CLE code back on the slide. One of the questions in the chat was asking a common question about barriers to entry. All these new standards are new barrier to entry, but that's, life is unfair in some ways because we have now barriers to entries about safety that we didn't have many years ago, and just the world develops. But it's also an opportunity to entry in many ways, particularly for small companies. Considering that we cannot compete on lower quality, bigger quantity and price only, the going bust of Forever 21 has proven that low cost, fast, it's also not profitable at the end of the day in many instances. Unfortunately, sometimes still is probably too much, but it starts to be non-profitable in many occasions. That in a world in which diversification and marketing is becoming so important, more than ever, to actually pierce through, small and ethical companies might be much more appealing to a consumer genre that is becoming far more careful about quality in general across all boards. Now, still, there is a lot of confusion. We cannot generalize, but certainly the world is changing and changing fast. And the new generation that are coming learning sustainability as a topic in high school. And I can tell that because I have 2 children in high school, and that's mandatory to do, interdisciplinary. And so I think we are in for opportunities, again, business opportunities. So with that, our time is up, almost up. I would like to do a very final round, 30 seconds to each speaker to say now, we need self-regulation and we need legal standards. That's very clear. If you have one wish in 15 seconds, which one could that be for you? Maybe we start with Diana.
I wish that COP26 will be a success, that we can actually get the right people in the room to agree to funding and to have a clear roadmap to 2050. And in this way, we will not keep having this same conversation that we have been happening for the last 40 years. So I think this is getting quite boring now. And we need to accelerate our roadmap. We have 8 years to midpoint. So that's my wish.
My wish would be that all the companies use ESG as a lens in their decision making, that they integrate it into their regular corporate strategy, that it's not a nice to do over on the side, but it's viewed as something that's essential in their business. And I think that will drive innovation, because companies will then have to think about how to do things better, differently. I think it will help workforce, because it will require changes in that will, I think, drive growth in those companies. And I think it will improve supply chains. So if the lens is different in decision making, in senior leadership in companies and also in the boardroom, I think it will have an enormous positive effect and impact on companies, and their impact then in turn on the E, the S, and the G.
I guess I'll just, well, in some ways I'll echo, I certainly would agree with Gail, and I'll channel Diana in that if COP26 is successful, it means that governments have made real decisions. And I think my main wish will be that, governments and political leaders are clear about their expectations, so that legal regulation actually flows from those decisions. And something we didn't get to talk much about in it, but I'll say I will hope and wish that other colleagues of mine in civil society, can work harder to understand where businesses come from and the challenges businesses face. And so when making recommendations and ideas of where businesses need to go, that civil society can be a stronger part of informing that by educating ourselves about what's realistic and what's possible, and holding companies to account for that, rather than, in some ways often unrealistic expectations. I think, that will help get us to warts and all reporting that is really meaningful and advances the effort.
Yeah, like Queen Elizabeth was caught on tape, off guard, mentioning government should do more. They talk, but they don't do enough. Hopefully now they will start remembering that more. And so it's, legal, self-regulation, accountability, transparency. I think we can close the panel saying we are moving in the right direction. It's time is, the clock is ticking, and we need to move faster and better. But hopefully now the direction starts to become clearer, also because we have no choice. We really have to move. And that can also be turned into a major investment in innovation and more jobs and better quality jobs for, for a lot of people. So it might actually be an opportunity for good change. as I would say, a lot of the companies that you have been working for, you are working with, clearly are part of this journey, and that is a club that is growing considerably more often and more and faster now than before. And so the legal aspect and the actual accountability, rather than just let's come from a free ride, becomes very important. And so thank you again to you all for being really very generous again with your time, your knowledge. Thank you to the audience. Again, the CLE has been shown multiple times, so we should be fine. And again, please, a major round of applause to our speaker for their really wonderful presentation. And sorry, I'm trying to put the ends so that it doesn't work. So I just do that. So thank you, and à la prochaine, hopefully in person in New York next year. And to other events. Thank you very much to the International Association, the American branch, for the organization and for allow us to put on the agenda a truly important topic for which international law and international commercial law are crucial parts. So thank you again.